In December 1971, the holiday season brought a mix of excitement and longing for 17-year-old Julianne Coep. She had just completed her final exams at a high school in Lima, Peru, where her parents were renowned German zoologists stationed for their research in the Amazon. Julianne was especially eager to be reunited with her father, who waited for her, and her mother, Maria, in Pucallpa, a small town in the jungle where they lived. On Christmas Eve, Julianne and her mother boarded Lanza Flight 508, a commercial flight scheduled to take them home to Pucallpa. The aircraft was a Lockheed L-188 Electra, and despite the festive atmosphere in the airport, a nagging concern loomed over the passengers. Lanza, the airline they were flying with, had a reputation for poor safety. In fact, just 2 years earlier, another Lanza flight had crashed, killing everyone aboard. But it was Christmas, and the Coeps wanted to be together as a family, so they boarded the plane despite their unease. Julianne loved animals and had grown up in the Amazon rainforest, often accompanying her parents on their expeditions. She felt at home in the jungle and enjoyed observing the wildlife. As the plane took off from Lima's Jorge Chávez International Airport on that sunny afternoon, the passengers were in high spirits, unaware of the horrific events that would soon unfold. Flight 508 was uneventful for the first 25 minutes, as the plane soared over the Peruvian rainforest. Then, as the plane entered the Andes, turbulence began to shake the aircraft violently. The bright skies darkened as the plane flew into the heart of a brewing storm. From her window seat, Julianne could see lightning flashes in the distance, and the turbulence grew more intense by the minute. As the plane climbed to a higher altitude in an attempt to rise above the storm, lightning struck one of the engines. The aircraft jolted violently, and luggage began to fall from the overhead compartments. Passengers screamed as the plane shuddered and plummeted, its nose pitching downward. Julianne held her mother's hand tightly, their faces stricken with fear. Maria whispered words of reassurance, but both knew they were in grave danger. The plane was in free fall. As it continued to descend, Julianne heard the roar of the wind and the thunderous crack of the plane breaking apart. In an instant, the cabin ripped open, and passengers were ejected into the air. Julianne, still strapped to her seat, was hurled out of the plane, spinning and tumbling through the sky. Her last memory before losing consciousness was the deafening noise of the wind and the sight of the dense jungle below. When Julianne regained consciousness, it was quiet, eerily so. The sounds of the plane and the storm were gone, replaced by the rustling of the jungle around her. She was lying on her back, still strapped to her seat. Her head throbbed with pain, her collarbone was broken, and she was covered in cuts and bruises. She tried to move, but her body ached from the impact. She had fallen nearly 10,000 feet from the sky. Miraculously, she had survived. The thick canopy of the jungle had cushioned her fall, slowing her descent enough to save her life. Her injuries were severe, but not life-threatening. Despite the shock, she knew she had to act quickly. Julianne called out for her mother, but there was no response. She searched the wreckage around her, but there were no signs of other survivors. Alone, injured and disoriented, she was stranded in one of the most dangerous environments on Earth, the vast and unforgiving Amazon rainforest. Despite her injuries, Julianne knew she had to find water and shelter. Her father had taught her that in the jungle, water was the key to survival. If she could find a stream, she could follow it, as it would likely lead her to a larger river and eventually to civilization. This knowledge, learned from her parents' years of research in the Amazon, would be her lifeline. Julianne stood up and assessed her condition. Her right eye was swollen shut, and she was covered in insect bites. She was wearing only a sleeveless dress and one shoe, the other having been lost during the fall. Her collarbone was visibly broken, but she had no other major fractures. With no supplies and no clear idea of where she was, Julianne began to move, determined to survive. The jungle was both breathtaking and treacherous. Julianne waded through dense foliage, her legs and arms scraping against thorny vines and plants. The air was thick with humidity, and swarms of insects relentlessly attacked her exposed skin. She stumbled upon pieces of the wreckage, scattered luggage, twisted metal, and once in a while, the remains of the passengers who hadn't survived the crash. Each discovery reminded her of the grim reality she faced. Her first priority was to find water. She spotted a small creek and began to follow it, knowing it would lead her somewhere. But even with her survival instincts and knowledge of the jungle, the journey was brutal. She had no food, and dehydration soon set in. At night, the jungle came alive with the sounds of nocturnal predators. Jaguars, venomous snakes, and all manner of dangerous creatures lurked in the darkness. For days, Julianne wandered through the jungle, fighting exhaustion, hunger, and despair. She survived by drinking water from the creek and eating small bits of candy she had found in the wreckage. Her cuts became infected, and she developed maggot-infested wounds. Her feet were swollen from walking barefoot, and her energy was dwindling with each passing hour. Yet she refused to give up. Julianne's father had taught her about the dangers of the Amazon, but he had also taught her how to survive. She focused on the small stream, knowing that it would lead her to people if she kept following it. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, urging her to stay calm and determined. On the fourth day, she encountered a group of vultures circling above the jungle. Fearing what she might find, Julianne approached the area cautiously. There, among the wreckage, she found a small group of bodies, including her mother's. The sight was devastating, and Julianne wept for her loss, but she knew she had to keep moving if she wanted to survive. By the 10th day, Julianne was weak, starving, and on the verge of collapse. She had lost all sense of time and could barely walk. Then, as if by some miracle, she stumbled upon a small, abandoned boat moored along the riverbank. Nearby, there was a small shack, likely used by local loggers or fishermen. Inside the shack, Julianne found a can of gasoline. Remembering a trick her father had taught her, she poured the gasoline over her infected wounds, hoping to kill the maggots. The pain was excruciating, but it worked. Julianne waited by the boat, hoping that someone would return. The next morning, a group of local loggers arrived and were stunned to find her alive. They immediately gave her food, treated her injuries, and transported her by boat to the nearest village. From there, she was flown to a hospital in Pucallpa, where she was reunited with her father. The doctors were amazed by her survival. Julianne had survived 11 days alone in the Amazon jungle, overcoming unimaginable odds. She was the sole survivor of the crash of Lanza Flight 508. Julianne's survival became a worldwide sensation. The media hailed her as a miracle survivor, and her story inspired countless people. Despite the trauma of losing her mother and witnessing the aftermath of the crash, Julianne remained strong and resilient. She eventually completed her studies and followed in her parents' footsteps, becoming a zoologist. Her love for the Amazon jungle never faded, despite the horrors she had experienced there. In 1998, she published her memoir, When I Fell from the Sky, detailing her miraculous survival and the life lessons she had learned along the way. Julianne returned to the crash site several times in the years following the disaster, each visit bringing her closer to closure. She honored the memory of her mother and the other victims. And despite her incredible story of survival, she remained humble, crediting her parents for the knowledge that had saved her life.